First of all, I'd like to thank you for inviting me to be part of Chronoi, and I am sorry that I can't be there in person. But I'm very pleased that you were willing to accept me as a remote fellow to continue the work that I've been would have been planned to have done in person in Berlin from here in Rhode Island. I was just this came to mind when I was thinking. The email that went out announcing this talk a couple of days ago talked about the different time zones that everybody will be in and the problems of organizing meetings and events with people in different parts of the world. So I thought it was a nice little segue to some of the things I will be talking about today, just trying to think about how we organize events that take place in different locations and trying to make them simultaneous. So I know for you in Berlin, it's I believe just after sunset, whereas here for me in Rhode Island, it's just lunchtime. We have these different contexts in which we're all participating in this event, and as we'll see, that's going to tie into some of the things I want to talk about today. What I would like to do today is just introduce you to the topic of my research project at Chronoi, which falls under a very sort of broad research question that is really too broad to try and fully answer. But what I'm interested in at the moment is trying to see how we can go about understanding the interconnections between time, astronomy, and ritual in Babylonia during the first millennium BC, particularly in the latter part of the first millennium. And within that sort of broad topic, there are sort of three questions I'm trying to think about. The first is, did the development of astronomy over this period, this is a period when we have, as many of you may know, very major developments in astronomical science and also in astrology in Babylonia. So did these developments have any impact on ritual practice? And secondly, as a sort of inverse question, did the needs of ritual practice influence the development of any of this astronomy? So they're the sort of two questions I'm grappling with. And the sort of third question that relates to that is, how would and is there any evidence for this impact reflected in the textual record? That is a more difficult question to answer. Really to know what we should be looking for in order to answer those first two questions, and then to try and see if we can actually find any evidence of that directly in the textual record. So let me just begin by telling you a little bit about the evidence we have for rituals in the first millennium Babylonia. And I'm going to be talking purely about textual evidence here. We can divide this into two main groups. So we have texts that are usually called ritual texts, which are texts that are either and straddle the borderline between descriptive and procedural texts, describing the activities that are part of a ritual, either in a sort of a descriptive fashion or in a way of setting out in how something is done. So a procedure for how the ritual should progress. One question we also have to wonder about these ritual texts is what their relationship is to actual practice. In other words, whether these ritual texts reflect what was actually being done in Babylonia, or whether these are a scholarly development of ongoing practice, whether the texts are an idealization or a elaboration of actual everyday practice. Our second source of evidence are what we could think of as documentary texts that provide insight into ritual practice. So we have things like temple records, which, for example, we have records referring to the number of animals sacrificed on different days of the month in the temple. We have letters referring to temple activities, referring to rituals. And we also have in a corpus of what's usually thought of as astronomical texts, the so-called astronomical diaries, which present night-by-night records of astronomical observations, as well as some other non-astronomical materials, such as some economic information and the information about the depth of the Euphrates as it flows through Babylon. But also we get certain historical events recorded in the astronomical diaries, including references to various rituals. Now, one of the things I'd hoped to do, indeed I have done during my time at Chronoi, has been to look at those references to rituals in the astronomical diaries to see whether they would provide any evidence of connections between the time of rituals, particularly, and astronomical events, to try and understand why those rituals were mentioned in the diaries, whether that had anything to do with astronomy. The answer is unfortunately in the negative, as far as I'm concerned, in that it's pretty clear that the references to rituals that are given in the historical sections of the astronomical diaries are there because of their political significance. So what we get are references to particular sacrifices made on occasions when, for example, Greek governors or the king and so forth visited Babylon. So it's purely they're in there for political, historical reasons, not for any astronomical significance. But we do have in other texts, both in the ritual texts and, as we'll see in some of the documentary texts, evidence of connections between astronomy and ritual and time. The bulk of these are really to do with the timing of rituals, which of course has a direct connection with the calendar and therefore with the astronomy underlying the calendar. We can think of timing of rituals in three different aspects where time affects ritual. One is in the kind of regular cultic calendar. So we have in various Babylonian cities evidence for pretty regular cultic calendars of activities that took place either on every, on a regular pattern each month or on a regular pattern every year. But we also have astronomy acting as a trigger for certain parts of certain rituals. So here's just a couple of examples for you here of astronomical events, astronomical observations that are made that trigger the occurrence of some part of a ritual process. So the first is from actually a Neo-Assyrian period ritual that has a section in it about various pots being placed and filled with various items at points that are designated by the culmination, that is when a particular star reaches its highest point in its motion over the course of the night. So these culminations act as triggers or as time indicators to provoke a certain aspect of the ritual. And the second example here is also similar. It is again using, in this time, not the culmination of a star, but its appearance when it's first seen in the night sky, for certain aspects of a ritual to take place. So in this example, in the first watch of the night, so in the first part of the night, on the roof of the topmost sanctuary of the temple tower of the Resh temple in Uruk, when the star great Anu of heaven rises, and the star great Anti of heaven rises in the wagon constellation, he will recite various liturgies. So we have here, again, astronomy playing a role as a trigger within a ritual activity for when certain parts of that ritual should take place. So astronomy being used, in a sense, as a way of delineating the moment in time when parts of a ritual should take place. We also have astronomical observations acting as the trigger for the whole ritual itself to be performed. So the clearest example of this is that we have rituals that are performed on the occasion of a lunar eclipse. So we have quite a lot of evidence for both in the Neo-Assyrian period, where we have the so-called substitute king ritual being performed during certain lunar eclipses. And then later in Babylonia, we have other rituals involving the playing of a kettle drum and so forth during the appearance of a lunar eclipse. So here we have the astronomical event acting directly as a trigger for the ritual itself to take place. Now, there's one other aspect of astronomy in ritual that I'm not going to talk about today, which is that sometimes within ritual texts we get astronomical objects, stars, planets, constellations, etc., actually as participants within the ritual process itself. So as in this example here, which is a ritual text from Uruk talking about the daily rituals that are performed every night during the year, that we get offerings made to Anu and Antu of heaven, to stars, and the planets and the sun and the moon. So that's another aspect of the connection between astronomy and ritual, but I'm not interested in that at the moment. For the present purposes, I'm going to be focusing in this project at Chronoi on this timing aspect, how astronomy and ritual come together through the timing of ritual events. Now, I'm going to focus today purely on the kind of calendrical aspect of rituals. I'm not going to look at the short time aspects of rituals, so the triggers for parts of a ritual during a night, or for in rituals in response to an astronomical event. I'm just going to focus, for reasons of time today, on the sort of calendrical aspects of rituals and how astronomy has some impact on the way that rituals are performed. So in order to do that, I first need to just say very, very briefly a little bit about the calendar that is in use in Babylonia in the first millennium. So we normally refer to the Babylonian calendar as a lunisolar calendar. It's not strictly true in the sense that what we have in Babylonia are months that are either 29 or 30 days in length, that are in principle beginning on the evening of the first visibility of the new moon crescent. Now, the reason why I say this is not a true lunisolar calendar or true lunar calendar is that this need not be an observed first visibility. It can be a calculated or predicted or estimated first visibility. And as a consequence, we never get months longer than 30 days. The practice seems to have been that the Babylonian day begins at sunset, and on the evening of the 30th day of a month, you would decide whether or not the moon was visible on that evening. If it was, that day would be rejected or turned back and would become the first day of the new month. And if the moon was not seen, was not visible, then that day would be confirmed as the 30th day of the previous month, and the month would begin on the next day. So it only relies essentially on the visibility of the moon on that 30th evening of the month. You don't have to actually then be visible on the following day. So, for example, if clouds are preventing the observation, that doesn't prevent the beginning of a new month. The other aspect of the calendar is, as in many ancient calendars, is intercalation. So because the 12 lunar months of 29 or 30 days are roughly 10 days short of the length of the solar year, in order to keep this calendar in line with the seasons, roughly once every 3 years, an extra intercalary month is added into the calendar in order to kind of reset and bring things back in line with the seasons. So that's the calendar that's in use throughout Babylonia at this period. Now, we do have a second sort of pseudo-calendar that I need to mention. And this is the thing that's often called the schematic, or sometimes the ideal year or ideal calendar. This is a simplification of the calendar, in which it is just assumed that there are always 12 30-day months in the year, and the month therefore equals 360 days. Now, this, I should say, is purely a schematic mathematical device. It is never a real calendar, in the sense that no one is ever following this as a calendar instead of the lunisolar calendar. It is used purely as for schematic purposes. but we're going to see some evidence of where schematic dates from this schematic year then get transferred across and imposed upon the actual lunar solar calendar that's being used in practice. Now I want to show you some ways in which this happens. We have a nice little window into actual cultic practice in the late 6th century BC from a group of around 40 tablets, like these two examples. What these tablets contain, these are from Uruk in southern Babylonia, and they record the number of sheep that are brought to the Yana temple for the sacrifices on each day of the month. And what's nice about them is, apart from the fact they record their data, they are dated, so they contain both the month and the year of the king's reign, so we know exactly when these date from. The vast majority are from the reign of Cyrus and Cambyses. So we're in the late 6th century. A few are slightly earlier from Nabonidus. And what they give for each day of the month is, so here we have 2 columns containing the numbers of sheep, different types of sheep that are brought for sacrifice. Here, the day within the month of going from day 1 to the last day of the month, and then sometimes additional remarks on certain days. There's 2 nice things about this, about these tablets. One is that it provides evidence of the regular cultic calendar in practice and how it was implemented. And the second is that it actually provides nice direct evidence for the impact of different month lengths upon the cultic calendar. Because I don't expect you to be able to see this, but in this first example on the left, we have numbers of sheep for each day of the month, and it continues up to day 29. There's no entry for day 30 because this month only had 29 days. Whereas in the example on the right, we have entries going up to day 30. So we have examples here of actual record keeping of the real calendar as it was implemented, with evidence of the 29 and 30-day months. Now, what can we see from looking at these texts? If we kind of look at them on the broad scale, what we find is that typically on every day of the year there was a regular sacrifice of 9 sheep being performed, but then on certain days of the year we get additional sacrifices. So the number of animals brought to the temple for sacrifice increases, sometimes dramatically, on certain days in a fairly regular pattern. So pretty much every month that we have evidence for, we find an increase in the number of sheep being sacrificed on the 1st, the 2nd, and the 7th and the 15th days of the month. We also find a significant increase on the 15th of the 4th month of the year. So even above the 15th that we have the increase on most months of the year, we have an even bigger increase in month 4. And then on day 16 of month 10. Now, the reason this is, of course, interesting from my perspective is that these dates are clearly relating to astronomical phenomena, in the sense that day 1, day 7, and day 15 are what we could think of as the schematic phases of the moon. So we have many texts, including the creation epic Enuma Elish, that set out the cycle of the moon based in its schematic form, so where the month is always 30 days long. And it says that on the 1st day, the moon will be visible, on the 7th day, the moon will be a half moon, and on the 15th day, the moon will be full. So these dates are here exactly taken from that. Why the second day is also included, I'm not entirely sure, but certainly the days 1, 7, and 15. Day 15 of month 4 is what we could call the schematic summer solstice. So the summer solstice, the day of the longest day of the year, in the schematic calendar that we find in texts such as Rahmen and many other texts, takes place on the 15th of month 4. And this is a day when we get this very large increase in number of sheep being sacrificed. And day 16 of month 10 is the day after the schematic winter solstice. So again, that seems to be clearly relating to the solstice. Interestingly, we actually have another very detailed ritual text describing a nocturnal ritual that seems to take place on the same day of the 16th of month 10 that Julia Krull wrote a very nice book that was published just last year, a very nice detailed study of this ritual on the 16th. So what's interesting about these dates, however, is that we saw from the previous slide that the calendar as given in this in these texts reflects the real lunar calendar, in that we have 29 and 30-day months. But these rituals are taking place not on the real lunar phases. So in fact, the real lunar phase would not always be on the 7th and the 15th. It would sometimes be on the 6th. The full moon would sometimes be on the 14th or even the 13th. The actual summer solstice in the period of these type of texts is actually usually much earlier than this. It's usually actually toward the end of month 3 or the very beginning of month 4. So it's much earlier than here. And similarly, the winter solstice. So seemingly what we're having here is these dates that are considered significant in a schematic calendar being transferred across and superimposed on the real lunar calendar, maintaining their significance from the schematic tradition. Alongside that, we have in these same texts evidence of another ritual called the Hiptu ritual that is mentioned. And here we have dates that are not the same every month. So this is the Hiptu ritual is always on either the 6th or the 7th, and the 13th or the 14th, or the 20th or the 21st, or the 26th, the 27th, and the 28th. And it's clear if we actually look at the different orderings and the occasions on which these are taking place, these are actually relating to the real observed waxing half moon, full moon, waning half moon, and last visibility of the moon. So we actually have within these texts evidence of kind of two calendrical practices, if you like, being mixed, two astronomical calendrical practices of a schematic calendar, significant dates from a schematic calendar being superimposed upon a real calendar, and then additionally, significant dates in the real calendar also being marked. So we have this sort of two competing rhythms, or two counter rhythms, if you like, of schematic and observed dates of importance within this calendrical, within these texts. Now, one other aspect that I've been interested in working on quite a lot the last couple of months is actually a related issue of calendrical uncertainty. So one of the issues of a lunar calendar, a lunar solar calendar, as I'm sure you're all aware, is that there can be uncertainty. In other words, how many months are there in the year? Are there 12, or does this year contain a 13th intercalary month? And so that can have direct impact. So, for example, if we're in a certain month, if we're in the 7th month of the year, is this actually an intercalary month 6, or is it a genuine month 7? And what rituals we perform on which days will depend upon the answer to that question. So therefore, there needs to be a decision made as to what the current month is. And similarly, we need to know when the month begins. If we have these rituals being performed on 1st and the 7th and so forth of a month, well, we need to know when the 1st is. Is today the 1st, or is today still the 30th of last month? How do those decisions impact all of this, all of these issues around rituals? And we can actually see this reflected in text. So in the period of those texts I've just been talking about in the sort of late 6th century, we have a number of letters that are quite informative on this very topic. So in the reign of Nabonidus, we have a letter that is clearly a communication sent out on behalf of the king to various parts of Babylonia, particularly to the temples, indicating that a particular month is intercalary rather than the first month of the new year. In the second example, we have a very similar case. This is from, we don't know exactly what year, but this is early Achaemenid period. And we have here the same type of information being sent out, but this time from the temple in Babylon. But the last example is the most interesting of these. So this is again from the same time period. And here we have this king directly addressing this issue of what to do with rituals. So we have a case where the king has said, this month 12 is intercalary. So, and then now he's going to tell people what we should do. So we should perform the rites in the month 12, which joins month 1, that is in the second month 11, as if it was previously, as if it was still month 12, not as if it was new month 1. So we repeat the cultic practices from last month, from month 12. Again, in our second month 12, we don't go on to our month 1 practices. So we have this type of issue. Now, those type of issues matter because we have to think about, as I was saying earlier on, the coordination, at least in principle, the desirability of coordination between different parts of Babylonia. So how does information about whether a month is intercalary or not reach other parts of Babylonia, and will it always reach there in time? One astronomical development that takes place in the early 5th century BC is the recognition of what in history of astronomy we usually call the Metonic Cycle, a relationship between 19 solar years and 235 lunar months. And the way this manifests itself in Babylonia is in a fixed 19-year cycle of intercalation. So now, with the implementation of this cycle that took place sometime in the early 5th century BC, matures, argued I think very convincingly, this was probably in the reign of Xerxes. We have now a completely determined in advance situation for intercalation. We don't need now to worry about whether the king is going to decide at the last minute whether the current month is really an intercalary month 12, not the beginning of the new year, because this is now all known in advance. But the other issue is around the beginning of the month. And here again, we have evidence of this in this uncertainty around the beginning of the month affecting matters. So here's just 3 more letters. I won't go into them all in detail. The first 2 are really just talking about are really just requests from priests in Lhasa and elsewhere, writing to more major cities, asking what date it is, asking whether today is effectively the 2nd or the 3rd of the month, because did the month begin 2 days ago or 3 days ago? And you can see in the second letter, this is linked to the clothing ceremony of the statue of Shamash. And so what Bonio, who edited this text, argued is that in this case, the month was determined to be 30 days long the previous month, and so the clothing ceremony was held on the 15th day, whereas if it had been a 29-day month, they would have held it 1 day differently. And the last example is one that is a text that's only fairly recently been published, and is a very nice little insight into this. This is actually from a group of texts dealing with a ritual for an eclipse that actually was a mistake, that they performed the ritual, but the eclipse didn't take place. This happened during the reign of Cyrus in Uruk. And as part of this sort of inquiry that took place after this event, we have this one letter from one of the participants complaining that there is no scribe in Uruk who is able to predict an eclipse and to determine the beginning of the month by accepting or rejecting the 30th day. God Nabu knows that we counted all year round to the 30th day, and he knows that there was no messenger from you or from the city governor or from any other man of rank from Babylon that came to inform us of the change of the month, so that we did not reject the day to mark the change of the month until the 10th of the following month. What he's saying is that we didn't know that actually the previous month only had 29 days until we were 10 days into the new month. So that 10th day was really the 11th day of the new month. And so everything was out of sync. So we can see the effects, this uncertainty, this delay in people knowing when the new month began because of relying upon some central authority to make this determination, could have upon ritual practice. But again, this is a problem that is basically solved in my astronomical methods. In that, again, in probably as early as the 6th century, maybe even very late 7th century, we have the development of methods that allow the prediction of various lunar phenomena, including the visibility of the moon. And as a consequence of being able to predict the visibility of the moon, they could predict when the new month would begin. Now, I don't have time. I don't think it's important to go into the details of how this was done. But what I do want to say is that we have many texts that contain these predicted month lengths for a whole year in advance, along with predictions of other astronomical phenomena. And what we find is that if we compare these predicted month lengths with the tested month lengths from other sources, so the month that was actually used in practice, we find a very large percentage of agreement. So one of the things I've been trying to work out is exactly what this means in practice. And what's clear is that at some point I can say this for certain during the Hellenistic period, and I think it probably was the same certainly in the 4th century, maybe even in the 5th century as well, that actually prediction kind of replaced the need to actually observe when the new moon was seen. So if you predicted, for example, that the month had 29 days, well, you didn't even need to bother going out and observe, because you just assumed it did, and you would not be contradicted, because even if you didn't see the moon, well, maybe the clouds were in the way, or maybe your eyesight wasn't good enough. In fact, the only time you really need to make an observation is if your prediction is kind of borderline. And we have some cases of this, where they say, we're not sure if it's going to be 29 or 30 days, and they have to go out and observe. But they're very rare. But if the previous month did have, is predicted to have 30 days pretty firmly, then again, you don't need to bother going out and observing. Now, the advantage of this could all be done at least a year in advance. And in principle, at least, and we have possibly small amount of evidence in support of this material could then be sent out to different parts of Babylonia. So therefore, you no longer had this need to worry about when the month began and this need to complain about not receiving information from Babylon itself. So these are sort of the things I've been trying to grapple with over the last couple of months, and I will continue to grapple with over the next couple of months. Is really how this played out in practice. What these calendrical developments really meant for how people performed rituals, and the difficulty is thinking about how we would detect evidence for this. It's certainly the case that we no longer find these letters of people complaining about and asking what the date is, but maybe that's just because we haven't found them. So I don't want to use that as firm evidence that the problem was solved. Anyway, these are, as I say, these are the sort of questions I'm sort of grappling with at the moment, and I'd be very pleased to have your suggestions and feedback as to how I should go about grappling with them further ahead. Thank you.